corporate reporting standards in South Africa are actually pretty high, and that has largely been a consequence of the King Code, which is a world-class standard in company reporting. But we do make a far-reaching proposal or a suggestion regarding the King Code, or a question. The King Code is still, like so many of these codes across the world, a voluntary code. Should we be considering making this a mandatory code? I think that via the JSE regulations, aspects of the King Code, or maybe the code as itself, are mandatory for listed companies, but this is a discussion worth having. We include some unlisted companies in the survey, and you can see how their performance differs from listed companies. We can see, for example, how well the mining companies do, and that does give you an argument for regulation, because the mining companies are, by and large, the large companies particularly, are regulated by the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and they comply with the initiative, even though it is not compulsory. As South Africa, I'm ashamed to say, is not. It's not compulsory for companies to be members of the EITI.
The average score across all the three sections of TRACK, the anti-corruption program, the organizational transparency, and the country-by-country reporting, was 59.5%. On the anti-corruption program, which was the largest share of the overall questionnaire, the score was slightly lower at 58.7%. The scores of all the 100 companies that were participated in the study are included in the report, which is available now online on the Corruption Watch website. And obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to mention that the top 5 companies were Rand Merchant Bank, City Lodge, Exaro Resources, First Rand Bank, and Standard Bank. Those were the ones that scored best. Across those 5, their average was 85.3% for the whole TRACK questionnaire, and slightly higher at 88.6% for the anti-corruption programs. So about 25% higher than the sample average. 14 companies, another 9 in addition to the top 5, scored above 80%. And much more worryingly, 12 companies scored below 30%. I'm not going to name them, but they are listed in the table 1 in the final report. Most of those 12 are privately owned, unlisted companies, which are therefore not regulated in terms of their reporting by the JSE. So as I've said, there was a big gap between the best performing company, with Rand Merchant Bank, which scored 87.7, and the bulk of the companies. So that indicates, I think, that there is much room for improvement. And although we can't say objectively what is a good score in this project, I think we can say relatively the gap between the top performers and the average means that most companies have space to improve their reporting. What's also, I think, important to recognize is that the bar on the anti-corruption program reporting is much higher in this project than it was in 2016. As Malusi mentioned, we had 51 questions on anti-corruption this time, as opposed to only 13 in the first round in 2016. So, that's, I think, an important thing to note, but equally important, it's important to note that that bar will continue to rise. And hopefully, if we can do this project again next year, the bar on anti-corruption will be higher. And so it's important for all companies to improve their reporting. Next slide, please, Tutula. In this chart, we've broken down the results by sector. The purple column is the score on the overall TRACK questionnaire, and the yellow column is the score on the anti-corruption program. The red ones are the average for the sample as a whole. And as we can see there, The retail and tourism sector actually scored best, slightly ahead of the mining sector, with finance, insurance, and real estate and heavy industry and machinery also being above average. The construction sector scored worst amongst those shown on the chart. The chart actually only shows companies, or sectors rather, which had more than 5 companies in the sample. I think it's important to mention the media sector, because the media sector had 4 companies, which means I didn't include it on the chart, but 3 of those companies, all of them privately owned, and I think the media people in the audience will know who they are. All 3 of them scored extremely low marks. So the media sector, with one exception, which was Naspers, scored rather poorly in this particular project, and that's something that perhaps should be looked at. Next slide, please. So here we've broken down the results by ownership category. Again, the purple bars are for the questionnaire overall, and the yellow for the anti-corruption program. And we can see that only the JSE listed companies did better than the sample average, which is shown in the red, the second from the left. What's also important here to note quite evidently is that the private companies did much worse than the other 3 groups by ownership category, as you can see on the right-hand side. But also interesting to note is that the state-owned enterprises, SOEs, actually did slightly better than the foreign companies, which included 3 that are foreign, and were close to the sample average. So that, I think, is encouraging in terms of the state-owned enterprises. And I should mention, by the way, that the state-owned enterprises included, there were 7, as Tawanda said. 5 of those were national companies, but 2 of them were subnational companies, Umgeni Water and Pick It Up, the garbage collection company in Johannesburg. Next slide, please. What we've done in this chart is to break down the sub-themes of the anti-corruption program. So the purple bars are the scores on policy, the yellow bars are the scores on anti-corruption program management, and the green is the score on anti-corruption activities. And this shows by sector, and as is quite clear from the chart here, companies did best on their anti-corruption policies. That was the best reporting. They did slightly less well on the questions relating to anti-corruption management, and they didn't do very well at all, I think it's fair to say, on reporting on their anti-corruption activities, the activities being issues like reporting the numbers of staff who were, of stakeholders rather, who were communicated with on anti-corruption issues, and the numbers or percentages who were trained in anti-corruption in the reporting period. Also, the incidents of corruption were included in activities, and that was not reported very clearly. Collective action is another one that I think is particularly important for the NBI and for other business associations. So I think this pattern was consistent of better scores on policy than on management, and rather poor scores on activities, consistent, as we can see, across all sectors, but also across all ownership groups, which we won't show for reasons of time, but is reported in detail in the report itself. Next slide, please, Tutula. Okay, here what we've done is just identify some questions where there was particularly poor performance. And I think what I didn't list here is the questions where there was good performance. And one I do want to mention here is the whistleblowing mechanisms, which were reported quite well, or performed quite well. The whistleblowing mechanisms are used by most companies. It's quite easy for people to find the number they need to call in order to blow a whistle. There's also quite a lot of information about the anonymity and confidentiality of reports made through the whistleblowing mechanism. So that on that issue, there was quite good performance. On the legal framework, there was also quite good performance. But poorly performing questions included, in the policy arena, the applicability to all stakeholder groups, not only to employees. Sorry, go back, please. Tutula, I'm sorry. One more, yeah. So most companies did well on saying employees were relevant to anti-corruption, but not so well on other stakeholder groups, particularly suppliers and customers and agents. On political contributions, performance was probably the worst in this section on anti-corruption policy. Most companies do not say anything about political contributions, and nor do many, or not enough, say something about the materiality of corruption in their operations, and also what they can do about that. I think I need to speed up a little bit. So on the management, resources used to address anti-corruption, it's important for companies to show their commitment to anti-corruption by reporting how many people's jobs in the company focus on addressing anti-corruption in their compliance department, how much money do they spend on addressing corruption in the company, and also to indicate that their policy is reviewed and evaluated, particularly through some kind of independent benchmarking. On their activities, quantification is needed on training and communication. I think that is very important. It's not enough to just say we train our people, but to indicate how many people are trained or what percentage of staff are trained in the reporting period. Also important is to indicate how many incidents of corruption were reported and were pursued, and what sort of action was taken to address. So that, again, the commitment to anti-corruption, the improvement of the anti-corruption program over time can be tracked. Next slide, please. I think this is the second last. On the organizational transparency, not surprisingly, all groups did very well except for private companies. And there's a lot of detail in the report on that. The country-by-country reporting, what's important here, and Dave already referred to this, all the companies did very poorly except the mining sector. The mining sector got 76%, the rest of the sample averaged 30%, a huge gap. And the reason we feel is because of the importance of initiatives like the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which effectively regulate the global sector in global companies in the mining sector to report on their revenue, profits, and taxes paid in all of their jurisdictions. And that point about regulation, I think, is very important and comes out particularly on this slide, because the private companies, of course, the unlisted ones, are not regulated. So moving to the conclusions then, just 3 points that I'll make. The first one is that there's a lot of incomplete reporting. For example, I mentioned the quantifying of the training, the disclosure of political contributions is another one where reporting is not done. I think it's important for companies to recognize that not everything needs to go in the annual report, but document the website, perhaps on a dedicated anti-corruption page on the website. Again, the mining companies reporting on their country operations are a good, positive example that companies can learn from. And I think it's important to say that companies should be learning from each other. It would be good if companies went to the pages of Rand Merchant Bank, Exxaro, City Lodge, the top performers, saw what they did and took lessons about their own practices from the best performing companies. This is an exercise for self-review using peers. The second point in conclusion is the need for more and stronger regulation on the content of reporting. Perhaps we need to think about going beyond voluntary codes. The weak reporting by private companies and the strong country-by-country performance of mines indicate that, and in the report we raise also the fact that what is reported is is not really checked, it's not really verified, and perhaps that needs to be thought about in relation to reporting on anti-corruption and other ESG issues. This is beginning to happen around environmental issues, perhaps also for anti-corruption. And last slide, please. And then the last point is that we talk about in the report, and again, it's been discussed, is that transparency is not enough. Anti-corruption needs much more by addressing your own corporation or even the corporate sector as a whole. It needs to be addressed across society, and collaborations outside of the corporate sector are also very important.